Andrea. Richards is an archaeologist from Jamaica and Barbados in the Caribbean. She obtained her BA in History and Archaeology from the University of West Indies Mona campus and holds a master's degree in Public Archaeology from the University College London's Institute of Archaeology, where her thesis research focused on the attitudes of the Jamaican public towards its archaeological heritage. Andrea has worked throughout the region as an archaeologist, and she's presently a lecturer in archaeology at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus. Andrea's interest in using heritage as a system and tool for climate action formed the subject of her doctoral dissertation at Leiden University under the Caribbean Transdisciplinary Research Project. She has published on cultural resource management in the Caribbean and the impacts of climate-induced and other natural hazards on the Caribbean's archaeological record. Thank you very much, Andrea, for being here. Please take it away.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm greeting you from the island of Barbados today, where I'm going to be speaking on digging against the grain, women and archaeology in the Anglophone Caribbean. I'm focusing on the Anglophone Caribbean because that is, first of all, that's the region that I work in, and two, it has a different trajectory from, for example, even the Dutch or even the Spanish-speaking and French-speaking Caribbean islands. So today, my presentation is also going to be a bit more contemporary in the sense that I'm looking at the challenges that we have with getting female voices into the field in the English-speaking Caribbean and what we're trying to do to help that. So when we're undertaking archaeological research in the Caribbean, we operate within a context of a limited funding for research infrastructure. We have a strong dependence on foreign academic institutions, and there is very little to no research being done locally because of these pre-existing issues. But we're also trying to see to help this by providing opportunities for female archaeologists, in particular post-university. So women working in archaeology in the Caribbean, they have historically faced and in many cases continue to face significant challenges, although their contributions have been substantial and often under-recognized. These challenges span institutional, cultural, and disciplinary dimensions. So we have, for example, it's a male-dominated field in the region in terms of universities and also those who are working in the field. And as I mentioned, we have the limited funding and resources for Caribbean-based researchers, which means that sometimes locally based women don't see that there are opportunities for them to pursue, and so they don't try to go into the field. So we have this pre-dependence from archaeologists that are overseas. So we also have issues with the colonial and gender dynamics, which still exist in our islands. Some of our islands are still overseas territories, for example, of the United Kingdom, or even in the French-speaking islands and the Dutch-speaking islands. Many early archaeological projects in the Caribbean were led by foreign male scholars from Europe or North America. This is still the case, who often sidelined or minimized the contributions of local women or women in support roles. When women did participate in this fieldwork, they were often assigned roles that are very much supportive. Now, many of these foreign archaeologists that came down, they did have graduate students, for example, who were pursuing their studies, and many of these female graduate students have continued to contribute to the region in terms of, for example, continuing the research that they're doing in the different islands, and also in bringing on more graduate students who continue to work in the region when these opportunities are presented. Fieldwork conditions, many persons look down on the fieldwork conditions. They thought it was physically demanding. I remember when I started out as a young archaeologist in the field, even the field assistants, they made disparaging remarks about women who were women and didn't thinking they could do the work in the field. So that exists and that still exists to some extent. There was some harassment in the field, sexual discrimination in the field settings. And the Caribbean, unfortunately, has not been immune to this issue. And it is something that we've worked very hard. As more females have emerged in the field, we have sought to address this issue particularly. Some of these women, they did not have their research credited in any way. And when I share with you some perspectives later on in this presentation, you will see that this is something that the female archaeologists still feel very much in the work that they're doing. They felt that they had to work harder to gain legitimacy, especially when engaging in critical or theoretical approaches in the work that they had to do. So when you think of local based women versus foreign, local Caribbean women faced a double bind of gender and racialized colonial legacies. Their opportunities were further limited by educational access, resources, and visibility within international networks. In contrast, the researchers that came to the Caribbean from Europe or the US often had much more institutional support, but still encountered gender-based challenges in the field or in academic publishing. This, of course, has led to them being more resilient and creating more of an impact because despite these challenges, the women in Caribbean archaeology have produced foundational work and still continue to try to produce this important work in what they're doing. Um, Much has happened in terms of making it our methodologies more inclusive that center on local knowledge, oral history, and collaborative research. And even we have women now playing much more leading roles in heritage preservation activities and museum development and public education in some of our larger islands like Jamaica, Barbados, St. Lucia, or Trinidad and Tobago. I should say, though, that in terms of the museum field, this is a field that has benefited much more from having the female voice in it in our region, much more than in the field of archaeology or field archaeology. We've had notable women working in the region. Elizabeth Wing, who was a pioneer of Caribbean zooarchaeology, and we had Corinne Hoffman, who's a Dutch archaeologist who worked in the English and the Dutch-speaking islands. Elizabeth would have started from the 1960s onwards, and Corinne Hoffman would have started from the 1980s, for example. But I want to highlight the early and mid-career Caribbean women today who are really trailblazing and trying to make the mark. In the image there is of Audine Brooks, who is a Jamaican archaeologist. She's no longer active in the field, but she has been a pioneer in terms of that local voice and being a mentor for female archaeologists coming in the region. We have Leslie Gale Atkinson, who is also the lecturer in archaeology at the University of the West Indies Mona campus, and the lecturer in archaeology at the Cavell campus. We have different campuses across the region. We have Louisa Daggers, who's working in Guyana. Cheryl White, who's Jamaican but is working in Suriname. Zara Lee working in Trinidad, who is an up-and-coming zoo arc, and of course myself and Lorna Dale Charles, for example, in Grenada and other islands where we've had persons who are trained in archaeology. But these persons have had to go overseas, one, to get their training. When you look at my trajectory, for example, there's no archaeology degree per se at the University of the West Indies. They don't see it as a priority. So it is put with history. So you end up doing a double major in history and archaeology. You then, if you want to specialize in archaeology or further your studies, you have to look outside of the region. And many of our archaeologists will go to the United States or they will go to Europe to study, depending on where the financial opportunities present themselves through scholarships. And then we come back to the region and then we try to basically change a framework that exists in the region, which is still a challenging field because of how archaeology is looked at or perceived in the region. When we think of the timeline of key milestones for women in the Anglophone Caribbean, or generally in the Caribbean, we know that a lot of milestones have been happening, even though women were sometimes sidelined in these areas or seen as assistants or students. So this really emerged from the 1950s, 60s, where women were participating in excavations, to the 70s, where women were much more involved in the university-based research. 80s growth of heritage institutions in the Caribbean, and this was able to better provide a framework for international archaeological work that was happening, or for example, if archaeological permits had to be given. Um, in the 1990s, we started to see an emergence of feminist and post-colonial archaeology, and a lot of discussions into decolonizing archaeology and ensuring that other voices were included in archaeology and how we worked. So, for example, indigenous voices as well as the voices of women. They were working to better include this and to expand in this way. Community archaeology became an important focus in the 2000s, and now there's a focus on policy climate resilience, for example, where women are working in landscape archaeology, for example, and in other frameworks to try and um, um, help the agenda to move forward. I'm sharing here some reflections because I spoke to about 12 archaeologists, female archaeologists across the Anglophone Caribbean. They're different levels, early career, mid-career. And they basically shared some of their perspectives on what it was like in the field for them. So one of the questions that we asked was, how has it been, what has it been like to navigate and gain entry into a field that has traditionally been dominated by men? And you see the majority of persons had mixed results. Some experiences were difficult, others were opportunities for growth, and some found it challenging and they felt like outsiders or were often underestimated. Um, Many felt that there was a notable absence of women archaeologists that would help them, that would have served as mentors for them, and their mentors were primarily men. Grant reviewers said women were not fit to work in the field. This is actually an experience of persons when they applied for grant funding. Of course, they reported that person in the end so that they would be blacklisted and not um, provide anything like that for any other woman who was seeking a grant. But they felt that because the space was mostly dominated by men, and it required resilience and confidence to operate in male-dominated spaces. And this often meant that they came across as being bossy, or the other words were leveled at them that would not have been used with men simply because they were women. In what ways, if any, has being a woman shaped your experiences or perspective within the archaeological field? You can see there the majority felt that it sometimes required extra effort to be taken seriously, followed by it gave them unique insights that male colleagues often overlooked. In terms of did they have to adjust their approach, methods, or behavior in response to working in a male-dominated environment? The majority said that it was mixed. They adapted to the situations, but stayed true to their approach in others. Followed by no, they worked the same way regardless of the environment. Then we asked persons to share a moment from their work where their perspective as a woman revealed something new, important, or otherwise overlooked in the field. They felt that while excavating and documenting, one person said that they made key discovery, and despite their role as a senior archaeologist on the project, they weren't acknowledged in the publication. Instead, other males who were not trained archaeologists were acknowledged. Um, some person said encouraging a new generation of archaeologists is very much like mothering. It requires patience, a willing ear, facilitation, sometimes stern guidance, and wanting the best for others. Somebody said in a recent project, they initiated the inclusion of particular assessments, and they felt that the methodology that they introduced provided deeper insight into the cultural landscape and connections between women and place. And it is felt that women archaeologists do offer a different perspective than men. Um, One person said their perspective was not shaped by sex, but gendered perceptions. They think it's more impacted by them being African descendant or indigenous descendant, which just says, if women are marginalized, there are other groups that are also marginalized as well. As a descendant of those who have been erased, ignored, or misrepresented, it's very important that they also have their voice in the archaeological research that's being done. And as a woman primarily managing field schools for students, you're more thorough in your planning, logistics, and management of these projects because sometimes there was no room for error. That was often allowed for male colleagues. It was not applied for female colleagues. Um, how might your journey in archaeology have been different if you had more women in the field? Um, some person said seeing more women in archaeology early on would have provided stronger role models and increased confidence in their own path. Today, they try to actively mentor young women and girls by encouraging them to study the field, involve them in fieldwork, and showcase female contributions to workshops and talk, with their goal being to make the path clearer and more accessible for the next generation. Some persons felt it would have been a different journey if they had not seen any women in archaeology until now. It had been it had not been shown as a viable occupation for women. They would have entered the field a long time ago, and they often tell young people about their job, and they're usually female. And amazingly, they all say the same thing. I didn't even know this was a possible job. Um, some person said they felt that the journey would have been different. Um, they didn't see women while they were in the university. Even though they are part of a women-led team with women in leadership positions. So this is how we're seeing that things are changing now as more and more female archaeologists are coming up. One person felt their journey would have been different had there been more persons that shared similar research interests as they do. I do my best to facilitate young women in archaeology with research opportunities. And this is particularly the case for women who wanted to specialize, for example, archaeobotanists or zooarchaeologists. They said that if they saw more women from the region in these roles, then it would have certainly made them feel more like it was a possibility for them in their work. So others continue to say that, they would have felt more confident. Um, in one rare case, and even though it's not in the English-speaking Caribbean, in Suriname, they said there it's more female archaeologists than male, and so that has helped the next generation of female archaeologists who are coming up. But one person said I believe it has been more women pursuing what I always wanted to do. I think I could have chosen to do it earlier. It took me years to decide what degree I wanted to do, and I had to basically choose only for me and no one else. But had I seen other women already successfully in the field, making that decision would have been faster. And also, uh, person spoke about the trailblazers and the fact that the lecturers, professors have been largely men. And that remains the case today. The lecturers and professors are mostly males. Um, then one said to create a more visible path for the next generation of girls. I try to include and teach young girls from a young age about the relevance and need of archaeology. And even now, what we try to do in the programs, we try to speak about the importance of their voices in archaeology, not just as female archaeologists, but as Black archaeologists working in an area, and why it's important for their voice to be the one that's writing these narratives about their region. This is very important moving forward, and to make the research and the field more inclusive. Um, One person said when they asked if they were inspired by any female archaeologists, they listed archaeologists that had worked in the region. One person said that all the women in my team inspire me. Archaeology is a discipline that people do not expect women to exist in well. And every time my team goes on the road, we overwrite that stereotype. Um, One person said their professor has lived the life she's enjoying and teaching that is inspiring. and others mentioned persons who have inspired them along the way. Um, and as I said, they continued to mention archaeologists that had inspired them. No, specific actions to encourage females to pursue archaeology career. Um, the persons felt that we needed targeted mentorship programs, scholarship, visibility of women in leadership role, exposure. The decline in interest in history and archaeology has contributed to this. Exposure to all aspects of the work, persons needed this exposure. Women encouraging women. They needed more women in leading positions in the archaeology projects to make them more visible. That and one final point that I wanted to make in relation to this was they felt that they needed to create a sisterhood of Caribbean archaeologists in the region for women, encouraging other women to break the barriers that still remain in the field. What in terms of what we are doing, I wanted to highlight this. So, the University of the West Indies has restarted the archaeology program, and in some places it had been missing for over 10 years. We restarted the program, and like this year, for the first time, we had um, archaeology at all the different campuses. In Mona is in Jamaica, Cave is in Barbados, and St. Augustine in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, these classes now have students interested in archaeology, up to like 15 students who are interested in archaeology. Cavell has 80% being female, Mona has 50%, and St. Augustine has about 75%. We have started up field schools to improve skills of up and coming archaeologists, so they don't feel that there's this imbalance when they have to work with persons that are coming from international universities, because that has often been the challenge where our archaeologists are lacking in particular skills, or anchored theoretically. And this has been a weakness for us that we're now seeking to correct with the introduction of the archaeology programs. The archaeology programs are still suffering a bit in the terms of there's not enough support from the university itself, because the archaeology lecturers even work part-time because even though there are sufficient archaeology courses that are on the curriculum, they're not being introduced. So, for example, we have courses in Caribbean archaeology that are listed, but we've not been able to introduce, for example, environmental archaeology and other things, and we're having to incorporate these things and have field school to so that students get the skills they need. We set up work programs, for example, with the museum that help them to analyze artifacts, and wherever we need to patch somebody in by Zoom, for example, to provide additional training, we do this, or we try to benefit from the field schools when they are here in some of our territories, to provide these additional skills for students, and also to help them to identify scholarships where they can go away and build their expertise. Another area that we're working on
Quick,
is to change the local framework.
is it
So
time?
sorry, Andrea. We're over the time limit.
Yeah, I'm just, this is my last slide. I'm
All
sorry.
right. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I'm just
Sorry.
wrapping up now. Okay, and we're also trying to improve the cultural resource management framework so that when these students also, not everybody can work in academia, but we're also building it up so that archaeologists can pursue their own research agenda in the countries, and explore additional research that needs to take place, and also to participate in cultural resource management in the country as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. This was very interesting. This is a very interesting case study